terrifying sight. I'm going to be very brief because the idea is, as Diana said, is to have as much of a discussion as possible. I do want to thank Jeevika for putting this on, and Zac, the chair, and we've got a great panel, and Rohan and Andrew. I remember reading somewhere that Schumacher was described as a nut, and he responded by saying, "I don't mind being called a nut. So every great oak tree is a nut that stood its ground." And he wasn't a nut. He introduced the theme. I can't say he was the first to introduce it, but he was the first to introduce it in the way that he did, in the way that we could all understand it, which it was, and I think remains, one of the most important concepts of all. Small is beautiful. The purpose of this evening is to ask whether it's still beautiful, to which the answer is yes. I would say that that concept is more important now than ever before in perhaps the history of our species. There's as you know, there's been a lot of controversy over the various Occupy movements in London, New York, and various other places. And one of the criticisms of the movement is that it lacks coherence, that people don't know what they stand for, that there hasn't been a manifesto or a very clear manifesto published, or I think there was one published in New York, but nevertheless, that has been this sort of enduring criticism. But as a result of that, which is partly true, it's become a screen against which anyone with an interest in the world and concerns is able to project those concerns. So it's become a sort of blank canvas. So I hope you'll excuse me if I do the same thing. I think the big issue, the big question that needs to be addressed relates to scale. And it's a question which applies across the board. And we've all obviously heard now the phrase too big to fail in relation to the banks. It's a phrase which has been used over and over again. Well, the banks are still too big to fail. Just before I come to yours, I'm going to mention, just respond briefly to the previous point, because I think it was absolutely spot on. I also worked very briefly with a group in Rajasthan, and this was an area that was at the really bottom of the ladder. They had nothing, and they were qualified for every form of corrupt Indian aid, Indian government aid, and they came to a point where they realized it wasn't helping them, and they turned it down as a group, and they put their trust in a local organization made up of local people, whose first task was to try and understand why their grandparents hadn't been so poor. They couldn't understand why were they so poor, despite massive investment in India, despite massive increase in GDP, despite their entry into this booming global economy. They couldn't understand it. But they learned from the elder people there, and I saw this quite early on, and again more recently. And they started to rebuild their traditional water harvesting techniques, and they started to learn how their grandparents, what they taught them in their own, they didn't have schools in those days, but they had education of a different sort. But the effect, to cut a very long story short, is that they now have a network of villages that have created a jungle out of a desert. It was a desert, and they've created such a jungle that it's become a tiger reserve. Not only that, their schools are based entirely on teaching people, preparing people to live in the environment in which they actually live. Instead of learning about the angle of incidence of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, they know how to live in the community in which they live. Their hospital is a very sort of flashy, modern-looking thing as far as you and I are concerned, but based on local remedies. They've become independent. And they realized that the state had so badly let them down that they had no prospect of benefiting from membership of the global economy. They tried something completely different. So I think when we look at development, there are any number of different forms of development, but mainstream development, the sort that has dominated, that we have collectively pushed and pushed and pushed like drug dealers, the kind of development that we've seen for the last 50 years is effectively a process of cashing in nature, transferring natural services and nature itself into cash, which is then spent by a very, very small number of people globally. That's effectively what development means. Development, instead of alleviating poverty, has catapulted hundreds of millions of people into poverty. The fact that we have seen a 12-fold increase in world GDP in the last 6 years, 12 times, massive increase. What is that? 1,200% return on our investment, if you can put it that way, despite that 1.3 billion people currently live in urban squalor, the very worst form of poverty. 110 countries suffering from extreme water shortages, nature's systems collapsing in every single continent. You mentioned the Punjab, 50% unusable, 50% desert. It was our breadbasket when we colonized it. It was known as India's breadbasket. So I might labor the point, but I think you're absolutely right. Development is an absolute misnomer, and the sooner we realize that, the better. On the other point, I think you're absolutely right. You've actually put your finger on one of the most difficult things this government faces at the moment. No government wants to govern, no political party wants to govern in an age of austerity. It's much easier to have lots of dosh to splash around and spend. I happen to believe, and we can argue about this, but I happen to believe that the government has to try and rein in expenditure, has to try and reduce, we're not going to get rid of the deficit, but to reduce the deficit. What that actually means is to slow the pace at which we're going into debt. So it's not really that dramatic. By the end of this term, when it comes to the next election, our debt will be bigger than it is today. One of the problems, though, is that people have become so dependent on the state that in a time of austerity, people do have to start looking after their own communities, they have to start looking after themselves in a way that they're not required to when the state steps in. I think one of the most callous and cruel of all government programs was one, unfortunately, my own party was responsible for many years ago, was care in the community. It is a wonderful concept. People should be looked after by their communities. People in need, people with mental instability, people who are unable to survive the hustle and bustle of modern life should be looked after by their community. The trouble was, and our government, previous government, knew it, that there was no community. We were effectively shoving people out into a vacuum, into a society that has become so atomized that it can no longer look after itself. How do you reverse that? Well, I think the greatest, in fact, the only hedge we have against social, environmental, and economic breakdown is the community. So the answer is that everything the government does, everything it does, should be about strengthening, not weakening community. And there are all kinds of ways in which that can be done. I don't think we're there yet. In fact, I think we're a million miles away from where we need to be. And there are all kinds of things that I would like to see the government do. But ultimately, it's got to be about strengthening community and reconciling the economy, the market, with the natural world, without which we're not going to survive. The government, none of the political parties invented big society. Big society already exists. As an MP, I deal with the big society every day. Most days I'm inspired by it. Campaign groups, extraordinary things happening right here on our doorstep, amazing organizations, people picking up the slack. You look at locally, we have the Vineyard, which closed down, which is a really valuable homeless center for people to drop in and really be helped through this nightmarish bureaucracy that they have to deal with, in which they usually can't. This is a charity which closed down a year ago, not because of government cuts, but because of local charities stopped funding them. Immediately the community got together, as a number of people here I recognize. The wider community, helped by a few core members, have replaced that charity. It hasn't quite got going yet, but it will do. And that is, for me, that is the big society. So what does the government do to strengthen that? First thing, it mustn't pretend it's invented it. What does it do to strengthen it? I think it has to empower the community as much as possible. I think there's nothing more destructive to a community than preventing a community from being able to take decisions for itself. As an example, not in my patch, but you get very parochial when you're an MP, but on the Twickenham side, there was an almost unanimous rejection by the community to a KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, application last year. I mean, I was bombarded, even though I'm not the MP for the area, absolutely bombarded by letters, and the council was opposed to it as well. I haven't yet met a councillor who was in favour. Go down there now, there's a KFC. Why? Because the community has not been trusted by central government for so long to make these decisions for itself. That hasn't changed. And I said, when the localism bill was being debated in Parliament, I said to Greg Clark, who was to Eric Pickles, in fact, who was speaking at the time, and I said in Parliament that if by the time of the next election people still find themselves absolutely powerless in the face of wholly unpopular applications, whether it's a Tesco, a Sainsbury's, a KFC, whatever, if we cannot stop those ourselves without being overruled by a remote and unelected bureaucracy in Bristol, we'll have failed on the localism agenda, and the government does not deserve re-election. And I think it's about empowerment of communities, absolutely central that.